right. Hey, well, this is actually, you're coming in on the very last study that we have in this book of Jonah. Uh, it literally is one of the more maligned books within the Bible where uh, it's pun intended. Some think it's just a fish story, a story about a guy that got swallowed by this big fish and then spit out. And that's where a lot of people go, it's just an allegory. But if you were able to listen to all the different parts of this, as we're in the very last chapter of it all, Jesus identifies with this. And so when Jesus identifies with a story, it validates the story, that because Jesus could die and rise from the dead, and when he says this was true, it helps you to be able to say, oh, this is an actual true story. And historians actually record a lot of the things that went on in this time period that we're looking at. And we're looking at 762 BC to 759 BC. So that's that many years before Jesus' birth. All right, well, in Jonah, we're going to do like what we've done the last couple things. I'm giving you the ability to understand especially Old Testament scriptures with new insight. And so we told you that when you come here, and tonight we're going to talk about 120,000 to 1, and you'll see how that fits in. But you have to put on your thinking caps. You remember when you were in school when they said, okay, now kids, put on your thinking caps. You come on. I know you were all old enough to remember that one. But tonight you have to put on your Hebrew Jewish thinking way of life. To think it as a Jewish person, looking at the scriptures, because remember the Old Testament is really, it's a Jewish book, but most Jewish people and Hebrew people did not realize the New Testament is a Jewish book also. It was written by Jews, okay? And so here there's two things how you need to look at the Old Testament that will help you understand it better. First, understand that the Bible is a divine integrated message system. It means when you deal with one subject, if you pull on that thread, it's tugging somewhere else. Sometimes it's tugging on something in the past that took place. Sometimes it's tugging on something in the future still yet to take place. And so the Bible is interconnected. And so it really is amazing how much, as God put this all together, 1,500 years, 40 different authors. You couldn't get 40 different authors in this day and time to write something that when someone said something here, it's connected back 1,000 years before and 500 years again in the future. Amazing book the Bible is. The second part of it is think in biblical patterns, not prediction fulfillment. Jonah has a lot of patterns that show things that are, as a matter of fact, you're going to see that many believe Jonah's in a pattern that affects you and I here, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. So instead of thinking prediction fulfillment in the Old Testament, especially when you see prophecies, think what's the pattern that's been happening here? Is there a pattern that God's showing in the Old Testament that he shows again in the New Testament, and that pattern could maybe even be seen today? All right. So Jonah chapter 3, verse 10 is where we left off. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, talking about the Ninevites, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. There's the key word. He threatened something here. Nineveh, here's where we get the subtitle, 120,000 to 1. Nineveh was a town of 120,000 people. He threatened to destroy Nineveh. That's what Jonah was going around speaking for 40 days. 40 days and destructions come. But the king and everybody else, they repented, they put sackcloth on, they fasted, they even made their animals fast. And you see what the scripture says right here, that God did not punish them. He did not destroy them. He relented from the destruction he threatened. So in your points tonight here, destruction is threatened. I want to tell you that's a very interesting way to think of God today is known as one characteristic. As a matter of fact, the world uses this against Christianity. Christians use it against other Christians. We narrow down God to being one thing, a God of love. And we say, because he's love, everything goes. This happens, this happens, this happens. Because why? Because God is love. And so to think about a God that threatens and even threatens destruction, that's really powerful thought right there. Here's point number one. You and I are entering into a time that the Bible has said more about than any other time in history. And guess what that time period talks about? A destruction of the world by fire. Wow. Okay. So point number one. He threatens this back here in 759 BC. That's the actual time when Jonah finally gets spit out by this big fish, and he gets there at 759 BC. Several things had happened that made the Ninevites and the king of the Ninevites tender towards this message from a prophet. Was that there was two plagues that came through there, and the one plague came in 763. The other came right before Jonah shows up in 759. So plagues kind of softened the people up, and the king heard this message, and they saw those plagues as signs. Now, they were a pluralistic society, meaning they had a lot of gods. And you know how God has kind of fun when he knows you listen to all kinds of things other than just him? One of the main gods that they had was Dagon. Dagon is the fish god. Yeah, isn't that kind of funny in that? The fish god, and God uses a fish to send a messenger there that's bleached by the belly of this big fish and all these different things. But destruction was just threatened. You and I are entering in a time in the Bible where it's more than just a threat. Point number two, the time period we are being plunged into is not a threat, but a promised outcome. Ooh. You say, well, wait a minute, could we back that off? Well, once we get into the time period that's called the Great Tribulation, there's no backing off. There's going to be 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And at the end of that, the world is literally a mess, ready for total destruction. But what happens is Jesus comes back at the end of that 7 years, and he reigns from Jerusalem. More about that next week as we start a brand new book called the Book of Ezekiel. I love the book. I have preached from it many different ways and different times, but never verse by verse. And Ezekiel is probably one of the, if you're a fan of the Twilight Zone, you would like Ezekiel, because Ezekiel sees a lot of things like the book of Zechariah, sees a lot of things in the other world, and he describes the things of God in ways that no other prophet does. So there's a shameless little commercial in there for where we're going next week. Point number 3. Deception is this time period's greatest weapon. Now, just because I say these things, you have to decide for yourself. You need to search out, is God really saying the world will be destroyed by fire? If he's saying that, where is he saying it? You want to read in 1 Peter and 2 Peter. You want to read in Revelation. You want to read in Daniel. You want to know that for yourself, not just because some pastor said this, that this is not a threat. It's an outcome, and that the outcome about a time period, remember what I said in these 3 points, there's more said about this time period than any other time period, including Jesus' birth. Most Christians don't realize this. For every prophecy about Jesus' first coming, there are 8 prophecies for his second coming. That's a little heavy weighted on the future, isn't it? All those prophecies of his first coming, for every one, there's 8 prophecies about his second coming and this time period that will be total destruction. All right, so this is not destruction that is threatened. This is a destruction that is promised through the scriptures. That's the background as we start here tonight, Jonah chapter 4 and the end of this book here. And if you're going, oh, wow, he's going to do a whole chapter, don't worry. It's only, if you look at the back of your page, 11 verses. And we're going to go through it very simply here tonight. Let's look verses 1 and 2. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. I can't even say that demonstrative enough. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong. God isn't going to destroy those bad people out there. This seems so very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. All right. Now, yes, Jonah's upset, and we're gonna look at that further because he's not done being upset. But in his upsetness, he says some very powerful things. Listen to the 5 things of Jonah's God. Number 1, he's a gracious God. Number 2, he's a compassionate God. Number 3, he's slow to anger. He's a slow to anger God. He's an abounding in love God. And number 5, a God who relents from sending calamity. What I did, I just spelled out the 5 things that Jonah, as he's upset, now, he doesn't know the future even though he's a prophet. He doesn't know that in 721, remember this is 759 BC, in 721 BC, the Ninevites, remember, they're not Jewish, they're not Hebrew, they're the enemies of the world right now. It's an evil empire. If it was the Star Wars, they would be the dark side. They were hideous, mean people when they took over an area. Remember, they did the sieges where they would starve people out till the people inside the city were so hungry they'd start eating their kids. I mean, it was really, these were bad people. And that's why Jonah didn't want to go up there and say, hey, God wants you to know I'm going to bring destruction to you, because Jonah knew the full aspect of God. And so he gives us that full aspect, not knowing 759, by 721, those Ninevites are going to come and destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. Wow. The northern kingdom of Israel is going to be destroyed by the people that God just saved because they repented. Now you see from the background of this, you could understand a little more the anger that Jonah is having. He knows these are bad people, and he was worried that God might pull something like this. Isn't that something? This is reminiscent of something that you're going to identify with fairly quickly here. But let's look at verses 3 through 6. All right, here we go. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in the shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. When I read that, as a matter of fact, when I shared that with my kids when I was little, Disney really helped with that. Have you ever noticed that sometimes, Disney, when you see a plant something and within seconds it just comes up magically? That happened right here. God lets this plant, he's better than Disney. He did the real thing. It wasn't animated. And this plant comes up and gives shade to Jonah because he's angry and he's upset. And Jonah actually becomes, at this point, many scholars say besides Jonah having his mission that he had for the Ninevites, he was a typecast or a foreshadow of, number one, Christians who are backsliders running from God's will. Remember, God said, go up there to Nineveh. He's in Samaria. He's supposed to go northeast, and he goes southwest. You know any Christians that do that? When God says do something, they do the total opposite. All right? So when we call something a foreshadow, that's, again, we're thinking Hebrew patterns here. There's a pattern in Jonah's attitude, in his life, and his decisions that mirror the last day of destruction. You catching this? There was a destruction threatened there. There's a destruction promised in the future. And Jonah himself mirrors, but he doesn't mirror the evil people of the day. He mirrors the Christians of that last season. Number two, followers of God who don't care about the lost pagan world. Do you know any Christians that would say, yeah, I don't care if God wants to wipe out all those bad people? Really kind of goes against John 3:16 a little bit there, that God so loved America and those that think in a certain way, and the rest, let them wipe them out. Are you seeing the contrast here of a foreshadow of a time of destruction? See how when you look within, there's a story sometimes within a story? Number three, followers who are disappointed with God for not bringing justice or wrath upon the wicked. That is, disappointed with God. What? He didn't wipe out the bad people? This is Jonah right now in 759. God saw that the king fasted. He called all the people to fast. They even made their animals fast. And they sat there and they said, maybe this God, the God that could call up a fish and bring a prophet and bring this, maybe this God will have compassion on us. So that's actually what we read in chapter 3. That's the way the king, and God says, you know what? I like that he knows that I am a compassionate God. And he does relent. And he doesn't destroy them. And now, this is way before Christianity, the prophet reacts like many Christians are reacting today. All right, we're going to build on that here just a little bit here. Look at verses 7 and 8 here. Remember, magical like Disney, a plant comes up, gives Jonah the shade. He's feeling really good. He's happy. Verse 7. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm. Who provided the worm? God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided who provided? God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint, and he wanted to die and said, this is the second time he says it, it would be better for me to die than to live. Let's build on what we just talked about before this. You can see an attitude here. Under your notes here, I put this in red because to me it's the saddest part of Christianity. Believers who don't know the heart of God. Believers that some of them swing the pendulum that they think the heart of God is just love. We talked about that, and that's how so many are in trouble, that they accept everything, that there's no more sin, that everything is okay. Because Rob Bell, if you haven't read any of his stuff, love wins. Everybody makes it to heaven. Everybody. Just because love wins. All right. And then we have the ones over here is, God, when are you going to destroy those pagans like Jonah? Yeah, and okay, so believers who don't understand the heart of God, this is a pattern that comes through, that God wanted us to see how he looked at sin and evil people. You notice the words I used? Evil people. Genesis 18, that chapter is worth for you to read this week. You go, I never know where to read. This is where you should read this week to understand part of the heart of God. This is the story. Number one is God would not destroy Sodom if there was 10 righteous people. Hello, Sodom and Gomorrah were very bad cities. We're talking really bad people. I almost feel like I'm sounding like Trump there in the caravan there. Really bad people. These are bad. But wow, seeing an image of God here. God said, yeah, for 10 righteous people, I won't destroy them. We're talking that which becomes the trademark of evil in people, that here we are this many thousands of years in the future. When we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, no one says, oh yeah, they were great cities. For 10 righteous people, he would have spared them. Now, point number 2, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 says, God would not destroy Sodom until one righteous man was removed. Peter gives us that insight in the 2nd chapter of Peter, is that before God then is going to bring his destruction on the evil, he gets the one righteous man, the relative of Abraham, out of there before he can destroy. Do you see what's happening? Before we get to Jonah, Jonah should have known. He knew these stories. He should have known the heart of God towards evil people, and that he desires for people to change and have a chance. That's why the whole book's known as the God of the second chance. He gives Jonah a second chance, and yes, he gives the Ninevites a second chance, and you should be happy. He gives you second chances, and me second chances, and third chances, and fourth chances, and fifth chances. That's the God that created the whole universe. Now, so number 3, like Jonah, we often underestimate the grace and the patience of God. But like the story of Jonah, there's a message over our heads that there is destruction coming. Now, for almost the rest of the story, verses 9 and 10. All right, here we go. But God said to Jonah, now, if you've been paying attention, this is not the first time he said that. Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? He asked him about being angry earlier, didn't he? It is, he said, and I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. Now, he's talking to the God of creation, and several times he said, I wish I could die. Man, aren't you glad God's not like... You ever have that season with your own kids where they're like, I just wish, and you go, okay, I'm going to grant that one. It's time. You're threatening me. I wish I could just run away. I just wish I didn't live here. When my son was turning 18, my oldest one, he pulled that, and the one day he came and his suitcases were on the front. I said, I'm granting your wish. You don't want to be here. You don't want to live by these kind of rules. You don't want to be under a household that believes and does these things. So what are you saying, Dad? I'm granting your wish. Aren't you glad? Jonah probably, in eternity, will probably go, Jonah's going, I'm really glad he didn't listen to 3 times I said, I wish I was dead. Okay, you're dead. God's gracious, isn't he? All right, in this, does it do any good to get angry with God? He said it a couple times. Now, we're going to look at this really biblically, not just psychologically, all right? Point number 1. Has he taken things away from you that has changed your perspective of who he is? Has something ever been removed from you that you said, is he still the same God that I knew before? Has something been removed? Boy, a great book, again, if you want to read and go, God, I want to understand your heart more on this. Read the book of Job. God took away things, and if anybody should have said, God, did I deserve losing my kids and losing, and yet I still have my wife that's saying to me, curse God and die. Hmm. So, does it do any good to get angry with God? The reality is, God can really handle, before we get to number two, the reality is, He can really handle you being angry with Him. Think about this. If you know the patterns in this, is anger always just a rage, or is it an emotion that says, I'm really disappointed with what's taken place? If we had the time to go into the Hebrew word here when he says angry, it's, again, I sense a failure on your part for me. That's the root of this anger. There's a failure on your part towards me. Jonah wants to be the center of the universe. But as you look at the patterns, there's going to be the Son of God that will hang on a cross. And he uses these words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Was he angry at the Father? Or was he showing us that God can handle anything that we share, that this is where we're at? I remember when my son came back from China, learning Mandarin Chinese. He said it's the hardest language in the world. I don't know. English still is the hardest language in the world for me. You that know me the longest go, he is speaking so truthful right now. All right. And when he found out that his second son was diagnosed as autistic, he was just so angry at God. And I said, so tell him. Oh yeah, Dad, I'm just going to tell God I'm angry at him. I go, he knows it already. It's a breakthrough of honesty. And I think this is part, again, if Jonah is a foreshadow of Christians and how we sometimes don't know the heart of God towards the pagans, and how God so loved the world that he wants to save the whole world, he's also a foreshadow of how we can speak honestly to God no matter what we're feeling. If the Son could say, why hast thou forsaken me? Can't you say, God, I'm disappointed in this. I'm angry at this. I'm so hurt at this. I really believe that's where most of the breakthroughs come through, when you're honest with God and say, God, so what do I do with this anger? What do I do with this disappointment? Great questions, aren't they? Number two, how do you respond when God blesses you with things you don't deserve? This is the little leaf section here where the magical leaf comes up and he gets blessed and he's happy for a moment. Okay, so how do you respond? Isn't it amazing that we can respond very happy and blessed very quickly and then be upset? All right. Number three, do you get angry with God when he takes you out of your comfort zone? And again, I'm stretching the word angry. Maybe you get frustrated with God when he moves you, that something's in your life that it seems like it's going to be a long season sometimes of depression, a long season of disappointment, a long season of an illness. The longer you live, there's long seasons of a lot of things out there, aren't they? Do you get angry or disappointed with God? Let me again say to you, it's okay to tell him. It's okay. Last verse. I'm going to wrap this up. Verse 11. So, verse 10, remember he says he's upset about the plant. Let's look at verse 10 again. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it, you didn't make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there is more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also so many animals? Here's the three things. And here's what I see, if you want to know why I put the title 120,000 to 1. It doesn't mean the 120,000 will against the one. It means God cared about the one angry prophet, just as he cared about the one righteous man, Lot. He cared about the 120,000. Whether it's 120,000 or just one, God cares. So, in closing, three concerns that God's concerns. One, his concern is so broad that it's for the whole world. His concern is so narrow that it's for an individual being. And here's the last part. God's concern is so timely that it's often the important part of the story. Soak on that a little bit. The timing of God in your life is often an important part of the story.